Study before you speak. The shortest route to the destruction of democracy is to foment banditry through culture and then try to control it through civilian disarmament. The national left has consistently followed this dual path for at least 5 decades and has always known perfectly well what the result would be: social chaos, followed by a hardening of the regime if it is in power, and insurrectionary agitation if it is out of power. This strategy is old, classic, immutable, but the pretext with which it legitimizes itself according to the convenience of the moment have been varied enough to bewilder the audience, which indulges in lively and sometimes fierce discussions about the pretexts themselves and never realizes the unity of the project behind them. Sometimes, as happens in Brazil, they don't even realize that there is a connection between the two simultaneous paths. Mentally cowardly people sell their mothers to avoid the risk of being labeled conspiracy theorists. They lower themselves to the point of defending tooth and nail the theory of pure coincidence, according to which actions happen without authors. Imagine how afraid these people are of recognizing something that is already obvious in the rest of the world: that communism didn't die in 1990, that it is now stronger than ever, especially in Latin America. 13 years ago, when Jean-François Revel published his latest book, La Grande Parade, no one in Europe or the United States challenged him on this point, which in Brazil is still an esoteric secret. There are even those who deny that Dilma or Lula are communists, but they do so because they don't know exactly what a communist is and, like liberals in general, imagine that it's a question of ideals and ideologies. In fact, a person is a communist not because they believe in such and such things, but because they occupy a place in an organization that acts as part of or heir to the revolutionary communist tradition, with all the plethora of ideological varieties and contradictions contained therein. The unity of the communist movement, especially since Antonio Gramsci, the American New Left, and the reshuffling of the communist parties after the dissolution of the USSR, is more strategic than ideological. In fact, this movement, whose demise the fall of the Soviet Union seemed to herald as imminent and inevitable, has managed to prosper and grow formidably since the beginning of the 1990s only because it gave up any homogeneous doctrinal self-definition and perfected the technique of articulating in a unity of strategic action the most varied currents and dissidents whose coexistence was impossible until then. Convictions, therefore, whether sincere or feigned, don't matter in the slightest. For a person to speak with any propriety about the communist movement, they must first have studied the following things. 1. The classics of Marxism: Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong. 2. The most important Marxist philosophers: Lukács, Korsch, Gramsci, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Lefebvre, Althusser. 3. Main currents of Marxism by Leszek Kolakowski. 4. Some good books on the history and sociology of the revolutionary movement in general, such as Fire in the Minds of Men by James H. Billington, The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohn, The New Science of Politics by Eric Voegelin. 5. Good books on the history of communist regimes, written from a non-apologetic point of view. 6. Books by the most famous critics of Marxism, such as Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, Ludwig von Mises, Raymond Aron, Roger Scruton, Nikolai Berdyaev, and many others. 7. Books on the strategy and tactics of the communist seizure of power, on the underground activity of the communist movement in the West, and especially on active measures, disinformation, agents of influence, such as those by Anatoly Golitsyn, Christopher Andrew, John Earl Haynes, Ladislaw Bittman, Diana West. 8. As many testimonies as possible from former communist agents or militants who recount their experience in the service of the communist movement or governments, such as Arthur Kessler, Ian Valton, Ion Mihai Pasipa, Whittaker Chambers, David Horowitz. 9. High-value testimonies on the human condition in socialist societies, such as those by Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Vladimir Bukovsky, Nadezhda Mandelstam, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Richard Wurmbrand. It's a reading program that can be completed in 4 or 5 years by a good student. I don't know anyone, absolutely anyone, on the Brazilian right or left who has followed it. There are so many people in this country who want to give their opinion on the subject, almost always with an air of wisdom, and no one, or practically no one, willing to make the necessary effort to give some substance to their words. No honest leftist will do so without abjuring their beliefs forever. No right-winger will do so without recognizing that they were presumptuous, stupid, and, in many cases, a useful idiot, sometimes even more useful and more idiotic than the leftist massive maneuver. The left thrives on exploiting the ignorance of itself and others. Wherever it exercises hegemony, the commandment is to never read the works of opponents and critics, but to spread deformed and caricatured versions of their ideas and biographies, so that militant youth can hate them under the illusion of knowing them. Universities that profess to teach courses in Marxism go as far as mind control, pure and simple. The right cultivates its own forms of self-delusion, which I've already talked about at length in this very newspaper. Perhaps I'll return to the subject in another article.